Linda and her daughter Emily thought they had finally found a sense of stability and happiness when David Harris entered their lives. Charming, mysterious, and full of promises, he seemed like their knight in shining armor. But as their trust in him grew, so did the secrets he was hiding. Secrets that would lead to a shocking betrayal, a brutal murder, and a chilling truth that would shatter their world forever. What they didn't know was that David Wee's lies would turn their lives into a nightmare neither of them could escape. Linda and her daughter, Emily, had always been a close-knit pair. Living in a small suburban town, their lives had been relatively quiet, filled with routine and the occasional small-town drama. Linda, a hard-working single mother, had always put Emily first, trying to create a stable, loving environment, despite the financial hardships that came with raising a child alone. Emily, for her part, was a bright, outgoing teenager who had dreams of a future beyond the small town they lived in. The two of them made it work, finding joy in the simple things like family dinners and weekend outings to the park. However, everything changed one evening when Linda met David Harris. He was charming, well-spoken, and instantly captivated Linda with his charisma. He appeared to be in his late 30s with a smooth smile and a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. David seemed like a breath of fresh air, a man who had everything together and could offer Linda the companionship she had been longing for. At first, she was cautious. She had learned over the years to be wary of people who came on too strong, but David's charm was hard to resist. Linda's first encounter with him was at her job at a local cafe, where David casually walked in for a cup of coffee. He struck up a conversation, and in an instant Linda found herself talking to him like an old friend. He listened intently to her, offering compliments that felt genuine and flattering. He spoke about his business endeavors and how he was trying to build a better life, though he never went into too much detail. There was something magnetic about him, a presence that made Linda want to trust him. Over the next few weeks, David continued to visit the cafe, always greeting Linda with a warm smile and engaging her in conversation. He'd tell her little stories about his past, weaving a tale of a troubled childhood and the challenges he had overcome to make it as an entrepreneur. Linda found herself becoming more and more intrigued. He wasn't like other men she had met. He wasn't trying to impress her with flashy gifts or material things. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her life. He spoke about his desire to settle down and find someone to share his success with. Linda, a bit skeptical but intrigued, allowed him into her life. Soon, David began coming over to Linda's house for dinners. He would bring small gifts for both her and Emily, and before long, he was an almost constant presence in their lives. Emily, just 17, was initially wary of David's sudden appearance, but his charm won her over as well. He was kind, attentive, and made her feel as though her thoughts and feelings mattered. David even showed interest in Emily's studies, offering advice on her future, suggesting possible career paths, and encouraging her to aim higher. It wasn't long before both mother and daughter felt that David was a blessing, a man who had come into their lives to offer them something better, a future that seemed more promising than anything they had known before. But there was something about David that Linda couldn't quite put her finger on. Despite his kindness, there were subtle inconsistencies in his stories. The business deals he spoke of never seemed to have any real details, and though he claimed to be doing well financially, he never flaunted it. Linda didn't think much of it at first. After all, he seemed to be a man of humble means who was just trying to get by. But deep down, there was a nagging feeling that she couldn't shake. Something didn't quite add up. Still, Linda was drawn to him. She wanted to believe in the story David had told her, the idea of a man who had overcome adversity and was now looking for a chance at love. She had always been a hopeful person, and David seemed like the type of man who could offer that hope. Little did she know that David wasn't the man he appeared to be. Behind his charm and smooth talk was a web of lies, manipulation, and a dangerous con artist ready to tear their lives apart. But for now, Linda and Emily remained blind to his true nature, caught up in the web of deceit that David had so carefully spun around them. As the weeks passed, Linda and Emily began to rely more and more on David. He was always there when they needed him, offering help with repairs around the house and lending a hand when things got tough. His presence had become a comforting constant in their lives. Linda especially had grown fond of him, her feelings deepening with each passing day. She trusted him, something she hadn't done in years. For Emily, David's influence was equally strong, though more subtle. He had a way of making her feel like she was someone special, encouraging her to pursue her dreams and giving her advice on everything from her education to her social life. David's charm seemed to have a magical effect on both mother and daughter. He had a way of making them feel important, loved, and understood. But as the days turned into months, Linda began to notice things she had once overlooked. The inconsistencies in David's stories became harder to ignore. He would talk about his past, about his business ventures, but the details were always vague. Linda tried to press him for more information, but David was always quick with an excuse, changing the subject or deflecting her questions with ease. One evening, Linda discovered something that made her suspicion grow. She had gone into her purse to grab some cash, only to find that a significant amount of money was missing. At first, she thought she might have misplaced it, but as she searched through the house, she began to notice other small things gone missing. Jewelry, her phone charger, and even a few important documents. The feeling of unease crept over her, and she couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. She hadn't noticed any signs of break-ins, but David had been around a lot lately, often staying late and going through things when he thought no one was looking. Linda hesitated. She didn't want to believe that David, the man who had made her feel so special, was capable of taking advantage of her. But the mounting evidence left her with no choice but to confront the situation. She tried to dismiss the doubts, telling herself that maybe she was just being paranoid, but the feeling of discomfort continued to grow. What troubled her most was that David had become so ingrained in their lives. He had embedded himself so deeply into their daily routines that it was becoming difficult to imagine life without him. Emily, too, began to feel uneasy about David's behavior. She noticed how often he would show up uninvited, how he would linger in the background watching her with an intensity that unsettled her. His comments, once harmless, started to take on a different tone, more suggestive, more personal. At first, she shrugged it off, thinking she was just imagining things, but there were moments when David would touch her arm or stand too close, making her feel uncomfortable. Emily tried to talk to her mother about it, but Linda was dismissive, brushing off her concerns as overreactions. "David's just being friendly," she would say. "He's just trying to help us." But deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She felt as if David was trying to control everything around them, subtly pushing her mother and her into positions where they were entirely dependent on him. And as much as Linda tried to convince herself otherwise, she too was becoming increasingly reliant on David. He had wormed his way into their lives in such a way that Linda didn't even notice how much power she had relinquished to him. One evening, as Linda sat at the kitchen table reflecting on all that had happened, she realized that she had begun to feel trapped. She had let David into their lives, into their home, and now it seemed there was no way to remove him without facing a harsh confrontation. But as much as she tried to deny it, the truth was becoming clearer. David wasn't who he had claimed to be. His charm and the image of the kind, caring man he presented were nothing but a mask. Behind it, there were lies, manipulation, and a darker purpose that Linda had yet to fully comprehend. The calm, peaceful life they once knew was slipping away, and David was at the center of it all. Despite all the warning signs, Linda found herself unable to break free. There was something about him that kept pulling her back, something about his smooth words and promises of a better life. Even Emily, who had begun to withdraw and spend more time alone, still couldn't fully see the danger. She didn't know yet just how far David's manipulations would go, or how they would all find themselves trapped in a situation where their lives would be shattered beyond repair. As time passed, the uneasy feeling that had been growing in Linda's chest began to escalate. She could no longer ignore the small signs that David's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and controlling. He started showing up at odd hours, unannounced, with excuses that seemed flimsy at best. He was always checking in on her or just dropping by to make sure everything was okay. Linda had begun to feel like she was being watched, and the tension in the house grew palpable. Her once peaceful life had become a web of suspicion and uncertainty, all spun by the man she had allowed into her home. Emily, too, began to pull away from David. She had become more withdrawn, spending long hours in her room, avoiding him whenever she could. His attempts to be overly friendly felt suffocating, and the subtle but persistent invasion of her personal space made her increasingly uncomfortable. One day, she found herself recoiling from a hug he gave her, noticing how his hands lingered just a little too long. The warmth she had once felt for him had dissipated, replaced by a sense of dread she couldn't explain. But when she tried to talk to her mother, Linda dismissed her concerns, still too blinded by David's charm to see the reality of what was happening. One night, as Linda prepared dinner, she noticed something strange. David was in the kitchen with her, casually helping chop vegetables, but there was something off about the way he was acting. He kept glancing toward the doorway as if waiting for someone. Linda was too preoccupied with the meal to ask, but something nagged at her. That's when Emily walked into the room, her face pale and clearly upset. Without saying a word, Emily handed Linda a small envelope she had found tucked under the edge of the kitchen counter. It was addressed to David in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Linda opened it, her heart sinking as she read the contents. The letter was from a woman named Jessica, someone David had clearly been involved with in the past, and it spoke of promises he had made to her. A future together, a life free from the lies. The letter hinted at something far more sinister, suggesting that David's promises to Linda and Emily were nothing more than part of a larger, manipulative game. Linda's hands trembled as she read the letter, but her heart raced with a mix of disbelief and anger. How could she have been so blind? The reality of what was happening finally started to hit her, and a cold wave of fear swept over her. She confronted David immediately, demanding answers. But instead of the remorse she expected, he turned cold, his eyes narrowing with something far more menacing. He didn't apologize or try to explain himself. He simply shrugged it off, brushing it away as a misunderstanding. But the way his jaw clenched and his demeanor shifted made it clear that this was far from over. That night, Linda couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with the implications of what she had discovered. She tried to rationalize it, to tell herself that it couldn't be true, that she must have misread the situation. But deep down, she knew she had been deceived. David had not come into their lives to offer love and stability. He had come to manipulate, to take advantage of them both. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Linda felt the walls closing in around her. She was trapped in a relationship that had been built on lies, and now, the damage was done. The next morning, Linda tried to confront David again, but he was gone. He had left the house without a word, just as mysteriously as he had entered. His absence left a sense of emptiness in the house, and Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. Emily, still reeling from the discovery of the letter, remained silent. She had stopped trusting David a long time ago, and now, with Linda's realization, they both knew that their lives would never be the same. David's disappearance was only the beginning of a darker turn that would lead them both down a path of destruction. Linda had tried to protect herself and her daughter from the truth, but now it was too late. David had already made his move, and the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways neither mother nor daughter could have predicted. What seemed like a momentary break in the chaos was just the calm before the storm. The days following David's sudden disappearance were filled with confusion and a sense of unease. Linda tried to return to some sense of normalcy, but it was impossible to ignore the void left by his absence. She found herself looking over her shoulder, wondering if David would show up unannounced as he had done so many times before. Emily, meanwhile, withdrew even further, locking herself in her room most of the day, her thoughts racing in the same direction as her mother. What had David really wanted from them? Was it all just a game to him? A week passed and Linda convinced herself that David had truly gone, that he had finally shown his true colors and disappeared from their lives. Yet deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The last time she'd seen David, he had been cold, almost calculating. There had been no attempt at reconciliation, no apology, just an eerie calmness, as if he had already anticipated the fallout. It bothered her that she hadn't pushed harder for answers, that she had allowed him to walk away without confronting him fully. Then, one evening, just as the sun began to set, Linda's worst fears came to life. The doorbell rang. She froze. She hadn't expected anyone, certainly not David. Her heart raced as she approached the door, her mind already spinning with possibilities. When she opened it, she was met by a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and his expression was serious, almost somber. "I'm Detective Thomas," he said, his voice steady and professional. "I need to ask you some questions about David Harris." Linda's stomach sank. She invited him inside, her thoughts already racing. What had happened? Why was the police involved? The detective explained that they had found David's car abandoned on a deserted stretch of road several days ago. There were signs of a violent struggle near the vehicle, but David was nowhere to be found. They had started to piece together a trail of David's past, his various scams, the people he had deceived, and now they were looking into his disappearance. The detective didn't make any accusations, but Linda could tell that the weight of his questions was growing heavier by the second. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Any signs that might help us piece together what happened?" Detective Thomas asked, his tone searching. Linda, feeling the pressure of the situation, recounted the last time she saw David, the night she had confronted him about the letter, and the strange inconsistencies in his story. She mentioned his cold demeanor, how he had seemed unbothered by her suspicions, but she didn't mention the anger and fear she had felt, nor did she tell the detective about the strange feeling of dread that had lingered in her gut since that night. She didn't want to believe it, but the thought crossed her mind. Was David truly gone, or had he staged his disappearance? Was he planning something even more dangerous? After the detective left, Linda couldn't shake the weight of the conversation. David was missing, but his actions had already left a mark on their lives. She felt as though she was teetering on the edge of a cliff, unsure of what was coming next. Emily had heard the conversation and asked questions, but Linda didn't have answers. The more Linda thought about the detective's words, the more she realized that David's disappearance wasn't at the end. It was just the beginning of something far darker. The next day, Linda received a strange phone call. The voice on the other end was distorted, almost as if it were being deliberately masked. The caller didn't introduce himself, but immediately asked if she had seen David. Linda's blood ran cold as the voice continued. "If you've got him, don't bother running, you won't escape." The line went dead. The call left Linda shaken. Who had just threatened her, and what did they know? Had David been involved with someone dangerous? Someone who could be behind this? The sense of paranoia that had been building inside her now flooded her thoughts. The situation she had once hoped was a simple con had evolved into something much more sinister. Someone was watching her, and David, even in his absence, was still pulling the strings. Linda tried to put on a brave face for Emily, but she knew things were spiraling out of control. The lies, the manipulation, and now the mystery of David's disappearance were all weighing heavily on her. She no longer felt safe in her own home. She couldn't trust anyone. Not David, not the mysterious caller, and certainly not the world she once thought she knew. The more she tried to escape from the past, the more it seemed to haunt her, pulling her deeper into a nightmare that she could no longer avoid. It was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with them, and when it did, Linda knew that everything she had built would come crashing down around her. Linda's life had become an unpredictable whirlwind of fear and confusion. The strange phone call, followed by the unsettling investigation into David's disappearance, had shaken her to her core. Each passing day seemed to unravel a little more of the facade she had spent so much time trying to build. She was beginning to realize that David's presence in her life had never been a simple con. It had been part of a larger, darker plan. As she tried to piece together the fragments of the past few months, one thing became clear. David wasn't just a smooth-talking charmer, he was a dangerous man, capable of destroying everything in his path. Linda had never truly understood the depth of David's deceit until now. The pieces of the puzzle that had once seemed disconnected were suddenly falling into place. The missing money, the constant sense of being watched, the strange people David had mentioned in passing, all of it pointed to a far more sinister reality. She had been swept up in his web of lies, and now she was trapped. Emily, too, was struggling with the aftermath. She had always been close to her mother, but the strain of the past few weeks had driven a wedge between them. Emily's fears had only deepened after the detective's visit, and she couldn't help but wonder if she and her mother were being followed. She spent most of her time in her room, trying to make sense of the chaos they had found themselves in. She had trusted David once, but now that trust had been shattered. The man who had promised to be a protector was, in fact, the one who had put them both in the most danger. One evening, as Linda sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her phone rang again. This time the call was different. There was no distorted voice, no threatening words. Instead, it was a familiar voice. David. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked up the phone, unsure of what to expect. "You're wondering if I'm still alive, aren't you?" David's voice was low, almost calm, but there was something in it that sent a chill down Linda's spine. She demanded to know where he was, what had happened. David told her that he had been forced to leave the area for his own safety, though he didn't explain why. His tone was evasive, and every answer he gave raised more questions than it answered. Linda pressed him further, but he deflected, saying only that it was better for her to stay out of the situation. "Stay out of it?" Linda whispered to herself after the call ended. "How could I stay out of it now?" She had already been pulled into something far beyond her understanding, and the realization that David was somehow still controlling the narrative left her feeling helpless. The following days brought even more confusion. Linda continued to receive anonymous calls, some of them threatening, others just cryptic. Her life was becoming a nightmare she couldn't escape, each call or visit from the police only adding to the uncertainty. She was no longer just trying to protect herself. She was trying to protect Emily, who was becoming more and more withdrawn, afraid of the unknown forces that were closing in on them. And then came the final revelation. Detective Thomas returned to their home, this time with even more grim news. David had not just disappeared, he was dead. His body had been discovered, hidden in a remote area near the outskirts of town with signs of foul play. It was a shock. A devastating blow. The man they had once known as kind and loving was gone, but so many questions remained unanswered. Who had killed him, and why? Was it connected to the trail of lies he had left behind, or was there something more sinister at play? As the investigation continued, Linda realized that her life had been irreversibly altered. David's death didn't provide the closure she had hoped for. Instead, it opened the door to even more mysteries. The trail of deception, violence, and betrayal was long, and it wasn't over. Whoever had killed David had left their mark on Linda's life. And now, she had to navigate the dangerous world he had drawn her into. In the end, Linda and Emily were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. Their lives would never be the same. The damage David had caused was too great, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would linger for years to come. They would never fully understand why they had been targeted or what David's true intentions had been. But one thing was certain. They had learned the hard way that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who can destroy us.